This episode is brought to you in part by our patreon.com subscribers, Lindsay Hanna and Laura Kitchings. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of HATM and helping to make this show a reality. And if you would like to be a subscriber, if you'd like to help produce the Historians of the Movies podcast, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Historians of the Movies. Now on with the show. Do you guys remember the movie Space Camp? I do. I was ingrained in my head. I watched it so many times as a kid. This idea that you could go and experience all of this space-related stuff as a child and then get whisked into outer space totally on accident. Sign me up. This movie's kind of always been in the back of my mind, and it's been floating around. And then finally, we found just the perfect guest to bring it to you today. And I'm talking about Kevin Rusnak coming back to the podcast, and for the very first time, Emily Carney. So we are going to have this amazing discussion today about the movie Space Camp, about the birth of the Space Camp program by NASA, what Space Camp meant in light of the Challenger explosion, the Challenger tragedy, both happened in 1986, and how we continue to remember Space Camp to this day. This is a rollicking conversation. We go to a lot of different places. Space Camp is a sneaky good history movie. So without further ado, it's time for launch? I don't know. But Space Camp is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Kevin, is the whole family set up now? Are you set up? Oh, look at you.
It's the Space Camp.
You like that?
Is the jumpsuit in the background. That's funny. I have somewhere in my house, I think I have it packed away somewhere. I've never been to Space Camp, but I have a jacket. I have the Huntsville jacket. So
Okay.
I think it has Space Camp on it, but I haven't actually been to Space Camp. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that. I'm hoping to fix that
How dare
possibly
you.
next. I know. I haven't done it yet. I'm hoping I can do it next year. Honestly, I'd love to do it. Either at the Cosmosphere or in Huntsville.
Been to the Cosmosphere.
Yeah, the Cosmosphere.
Oh yeah, I know it. It's, in Kansas. Yeah.
Yeah, in Kansas. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's very
and I like
cool.
Huntsville as well. So, but yeah, I'd like to do one of them just because I've never done it before. I've got friends who've done all of them, and they look just like, I don't even care. I don't care if my team wins anything. I just want to have fun. That's really all I care about. It just looks like a good time.
I guess maybe this is the ideal place to start, because Kevin just shows up just now, and he did this the last time when we did do the right thing. When we did the right stuff, that would be a mashup. Do the right stuff.
Yeah.
But so last time you showed up, Kevin, with like stuff in the background, and now you're showing up with spaces, which I can't wait, because you're coming back to do First Man. So I'm assuming you're literally going to do like a piece of the moon in your background whenever we do that one.
I do, in fact, have a piece of Apollo 16. I got a piece of the Apollo 16 command module heat shield. So not quite Neil Armstrong. A bit later in the Apollo program. But yeah, that was my kind of going away
Holy
present
cow.
when I left NASA.
Did I tell you that my ex-wife's grandfather worked on the Apollo heat shields?
Oh, no. Was it Avco that was the contractor, I think?
I will find out, because they love like talking about this, and he was a dude I just loved. He was like this really wonderful, like I was married to his granddaughter for a while, but boy, did I ever love like her grandparents, Roger and Charlotte, and they were just amazing. I loved that dude. But yeah, he worked on the heat shields on the Apollo program. So I don't know the. I'll have to find out. I'll let you know. So,
Sure.
That said, do we just jump in and like do the introductions here, because Kevin, you're returning. Emily, tonight's your first night on his Movies podcast. I'm so excited. So we were schmoozing as we were waiting. for Kevin to arrive. I'm so excited to have you both of you here to talk about this movie. I have to tell you, I tweeted last night, or I tweeted and I put on Blue Sky about that we were going to be recording this because I watched it on YouTube yesterday, and people lost their freaking minds. This is oh yeah,
Wow.
people love space camp. People of a certain age, people of our age. I'm 47.
Yeah.
People of our age, right? Love this. If you grew up in the 80s and you're kind of nerdy, like you came to this film. Like this film was part of your
Yes.
life.
Yep. I saw it. I think I saw it in the theater. Um, I was telling Jason, Kevin, that I had the Scholastic book. They had a Scholastic book. You went to the book fair with your $5 and you bought the Scholastic books. I had that. Oh God, yeah, yeah. So I was all over Space Camp back then.
You guys want to introduce yourselves to our listeners? Emily, you want to go first since it's your first time here on our pod?
Sure. I'm Emily Carney. I'm an independent space historian. When I say that, I'm not aligned with any like particular institution or anything like that. Not with like the Smithsonian or anything. But I started a group about 13 years ago called Space Hipsters on Facebook. We're one of the largest space enthusiast groups probably in the world. And I'm trying to think. I had a podcast called Space and Things. We're kind of on hiatus right now, but where our shows are still out there. We have like 207 episodes, I think,
Oh my
so they're
gosh.
still listenable. Um, and I'm trying to think. God, I've done a bunch of other stuff too. I got a book coming out in January with Bruce McCandless III called Starbound. It's on. You can pre-order it now if you want to. Yeah. So I got a lot of things going on. God, I'll stop there. There's a
Okay.
lot going on. I'll stop. But yeah, basically, I'm an independent space historian. I love everything space shuttle related.
Kevin, you want to reintroduce yourself to the team?
So right now, I'm the chief historian for the Air Force Life Cycle Management Center. As I said last time, a little bit of an awkward name, but basically we manage all of the programs that the Air Force has for basically anything but rockets and nuclear weapons. We handle those, whether it's an F-15 or a B-2 bomber or whatever. That's my organization. Although I have to add the disclaimer that I'm here in a personal capacity, not in a professional one. So any opinions expressed here and any bad humor is solely my responsibility, not the Department of Defense, the Air Force, or anything, or pretty much anything else. Before that, I've been doing this Air Force history thing for about 22 years. Before that, I was in the NASA Johnson Space Center History Office, so that was my kind of exposure to the human spaceflight program for a few years right out of grad school. I went to Georgia Tech back in the day, so so I've been doing aerospace history from both the civilian and military side for a long time. It was a passion of mine as a kid. Any of the people who are watching this instead of listening may notice, I've got the space camp flight suit in the background, and that came out of my being exactly what you were describing, one of those sort of nerdy kids who was really into the space program back in the 80s and was lucky enough to make a career out of it.
I actually want to bring back this thing we've stepped away from a little bit. I wanted to ask you guys tonight before we start jumping into this film. Coke or Pepsi?
Oh, Coke.
All right, you can stay. Kevin?
So growing up in Ohio, I was a Pepsi guy for a long time. Then after I got married, my wife was a Coke person, so I converted to Diet Coke. And then I have actually been off the Coke wagon for, I don't know, 12, 15 years, something like that. Haven't had any of that kind of stuff. So now I drink ginger ale, or I'll have the occasional beer here. So that's my thing now.
I feel like it's more of an ideology than anything else, So I'm drinking water tonight during this thing because because I live in Colorado, and like if you don't drink 16 gallons of water a day out here in Colorado, you just dry up. It's so dry out here in the Rockies. The air is super dry. It's hard. So I still drink my soda because, I'm trying to give myself diabetes, I guess. I don't know. But like, it's more about the way that I judge you guys as a person. So, Emily, you've passed the test. Kevin, yes, you also cat. So congratulations. Um, I mean, really, isn't Pepsi like the Soyuz of soft drinks? I don't know. I'm trying to make this
It's
some
the
kind of
choice
thing.
of a new generation.
Oh God! Well, dude, do you remember those commercials? I'm sure you guys do
That
from
was
the
about the
'80s.
time the Space Camp movie was
Yes.
out, right?
We have so much
Yeah.
of this because talking about this last night, like on Twitter and stuff like that, like I said, people were losing their minds, and it became very apparent that there's a ton of nostalgia for people of a certain age. As you're approaching 50 and you're in your mid to late 40s and in your 50s, this movie, which did not perform all that well at the box office, is certainly like wrapped up in. I mean, I'm telling you, more than most films when I announce, hey, we're going to do this movie or that, people are like, oh my God, I love this movie so much. It was crazy. And I remember I was reading, Leah Thompson had talked about this in a previous interview, where she was like, she gets messages all the time for people to say, I went into space, or I went into chemistry, or I went into STEM because of this movie. This movie has like this huge effect on people. So I'm kind of wondering, as we're jumping into this movie, start talking about it, like, we look back now, what are your memories of Space Camp, of this movie? Do you remember the first time? Emily, you're saying you saw it at the theater, right? Like, how old
Yeah.
were you when you saw this movie, and like, how did you come to this movie?
Okay, I was obsessed. I was like a space nerd already. I grew up not very far from the Space Coast. I grew up on the Bay side of Florida. Like I grew up in Oldsmar, which is in Pinellas County, by Tampa.
Oh yeah.
So I was fairly close to the Space Coast, like probably 120 miles out. So you could go outside and just see shuttle launches, like, and in the mid 80s, before unfortunately Challenger happened, they were launching them. They were starting to have a pretty high launch rate. Like I think in 85 they had 11 or 12 launches.
Mm-hmm.
And I was real little, but I was just obsessed. I thought it was the coolest. Uh, I was just obsessed with the space shuttle in general. I had the space shuttle. Here's some nostalgia. I had the Space Shuttle Operator's Manual. It was a book that a lot of people had in the 80s. It was basically, it was I think for students, but it was a cool little book. But yeah, so what happened was I actually remember this because I this was kind of a dark time, but Challenger happened in January that year, and I was 7, but I remember it vividly because actually this is terrible. I actually saw it, like a lot of my generation, happen live. Like
Yep.
and I saw it outside. I was outside and we saw it because yeah, we were in the schoolyard watching it. Yeah, pretty traumatic, and we didn't know what we were looking at because we were kids. We were just like, oh, okay. Like we didn't know until we came back from lunch because we
Yeah.
went to lunch afterwards. We had no idea. So that was a horrible tragedy in Central Florida at the time. Everybody was mourning because we all saw it. It was just, yeah. So sorry to be so dark with the beginning of this, but I remember a few months later, Space Camp came out, and it um, probably was not the best time, unfortunately, for that movie to come out. But my memories of the movie are very positive because I felt like it was hopeful. It wasn't. I think a big criticism of the movie at the time was it was trying to like hinge on to the Challenger disaster, which I think is stupid because if you've seen the movie Space Camp, it's kind of cheesy. It's very positive. It's like a kind of a almost like a I wouldn't say a feel good movie, but it's like it's to inspire kids. It's to
Mm-hmm.
inspire the young people. There was nothing dark about the movie. Like I could see if they did something exploitive about the tragedy that would have been messed up, but this movie wasn't like that. So even though well even though they had a thermal curtain failure. But we'll get to that later, though. Um, but yeah, I remember going to see the movie in the theater, and gosh, if you've seen the movie, it has some very of its time VFX, visual effects. It shows. I'm probably jumping way ahead here. It shows, um, this control room that looks like something out of War Games. A lot of like wireframe type graphics. But
Mm-hmm.
back then, that was like, whoa! They're like in the future. It's like the future of space, And I remember also the VFX of, okay, this is for hardcore people who've seen the movie a lot of times, showing the shuttle Atlantis and space station Daedalus. Uh, yeah, I remember that vividly because that was what Space Station Freedom was supposed to look like. Space Station Freedom was, if you were alive at the time and you wrote NASA like I did to ask them for like material, they would send you this bit. I wish I had it. I should have brought it out, but if you were my age at the time, you wrote NASA a letter, they would send you a big, huge, like, thing in the mail, like a packet of just information and posters. It was
Kevin's
amazing.
about to bust out his entire correspondence with NASA
Yes.
right now.
I mean, it was incredible. And it was all paper, obviously, because we didn't, now it's internet. But back then it was all paper posters, pamphlets, booklets, etc. It was amazing. And it was like the golden age. But I remember, I think I got a poster of Space Station Freedom, which was supposed to be the next big space station. I won't get into the history of that because that's very long and convoluted. But there's like a um, sort of a composite version of Space Station Freedom in the movie, which I thought was kind of neat. Space Station Daedalus. I don't know where they got that from, but yeah. So I thought that was cool, but I just remember as a kid, and there was also a Scholastic book that was like an offshoot. Okay, I don't know if they do this anymore, but back in the day, you could go to the Scholastic Book Fair. If you were in elementary school, you'd have $5. You'd go in there and get like two books and a poster, and you felt like a high roller. You were like, yes, I have a book, some books and a poster. It was amazing. So, yeah, I think I got the Space Camp book as well, which followed the movie. But I honestly, at the time, um, I don't have anything. I know it's a cheesy movie. I know it's of its era because it's from the 80s and everybody looks very 80s in the movie, but it was actually, I felt, a positive movie, and its message I felt was pretty positive, and it had strong women roles in it, which is really like ahead of its time to me because I won't I won't try to get I don't want to get on a political soapbox at all, but there's still issues about gender parity in space flight and things like that, and frankly, not that many women have been to space yet. And it's cool because the three of the main leads in the film, Leah Thompson, um, Kelly Preston, and Kate Capshaw, they're these women astronauts, or women going into space, which I thought was really cool. Like I'm glad they put that in the film. So that's really what I got to say. But I felt like for the time, it was a positive movie. It's unfortunate that when it came out, something horrible happened a few months in real life, and nobody, I think, expected that.
No, we're definitely going to come back and talk about Challenger, in our memories of Challenger, and like how Challenger shapes this film, and also how like the memory of it today, but also with the demise of the Space Shuttle program. We're going to come back to this and talk about this as well. Kevin, when did you come to this film? Like, do you recall the first time you saw this, or what this film meant to you as a kid?
Yeah, so I was a little bit older. I was 13 or so when it came out, and I remember that mostly because of the association with Challenger and the whole sort of everything that happened with the space program in the ensuing months. Because the Challenger accident obviously happened in January. This movie came out, well, maybe May or June, several months after the accident.
May.
Obviously, it would have been filmed many months before, right? And so I'm sure they had these debates about, should we release this? Is this appropriate? That kind of thing. I'm not privy to that. I didn't look it up. Maybe I should have. Maybe one of you did. But I do remember going to see it in the theater because I was very much into the space program at the time. And I know we're going to talk about Challenger later, so I won't get into that part too much. But I remember seeing the movie probably just once. I remember the movie theater even. It was at the Dayton Mall here in Ohio. That was where we went to go see our movies at the time. Same place I saw Star Wars, the original Star Wars, actually in the movie theater. But then it was the following, let's see, in 87. It would have been about a year later, 1987, when I actually went to space camp myself. And that's what the people who are watching the video, you can see the flight suit in the background. So I think, the movie coming on the heels of the Challenger accident kind of made those of us who were into the space program really think about, sort of the meaning of the program to ourselves. Did that solidify our desire, our commitment to the program, to being involved in it? And for me, it certainly did. You had this big event happen where suddenly the space program that might have been, say, probably waning in public interest, with the exception, obviously, of the Teacher in Space program. But then suddenly the world was paying attention to the space program again, not necessarily in a positive way. This is probably a great example of how not all publicity is good publicity, right? But for me, having seen the movie on the heels of the accident, was like, yeah, this sort of enthusiasm for space is kind of what, was what I felt, is what I had internalized. So it was like, yeah, it's great to have this sort of feel good example of the space program coming on the heels of the Challenger accident. So for me personally, the movie meant a lot. And like I said, that kind of really reinforced my desire to go to space camp. Most of us had heard of space camp by that time. I think it had opened, maybe 1983 or 84, somewhere around there, several years earlier anyway. And I was determined to go to be an attendee there. It just looked, amazing. And the movie made it look even more amazing. And of course, there's some disconnect with the reality. We didn't get to go sit in an actual space shuttle or anything like that. But, like I said, about a year later, I was able to realize that that kind of childhood dream of attending space camp. So yeah, the movie really kind of helped keep that enthusiasm alive for me and really kind of solidify that interest that I'd had at the time.
Yeah, I remember I came to this. I probably watched this on HBO. I didn't see this theater, but I remember I watched this. I think we taped it. I remember watching it over and over and over again because I do want to talk about the cast of this film, and that's part of the reason why I watched this film. Was Leah Thompson? I was 9 years old when this movie comes out, and I discovered what love was in 1986 with Leah. Oh my god, I was like, what? Hi, like. Yeah. Okay. So I was watching last night. I went back and rewatched this. Watched this on YouTube. I was shocked at first when I found out that this movie is not streaming anywhere. I was usually when we do these, I'm like, okay, I can find it. I can rent it. I'm like, how is this movie in 2024 not available? I was completely shocked. We did watch the really bad, like it's kind of the graphics, whatever. I was able to rewatch this, and you go back and watch this film. And you remember that she's in it. You remember like they're trying to push like and introducing Tate Donovan, like was Tate was gonna be the thing. But this cast is loaded, absolutely loaded with like obviously Leah Thompson. You've got Kate Capshaw, Larry Scott, better known from Revenge of the Nerds, is in this film. Tom Skerritt, 3 weeks after his role as Viper in Top Gun, is in this movie.
Yeah,
playing the same role. Okay, and then we have to talk about this young guy, Leaf Phoenix. Like, who knew what he was going to turn out to be? So, you guys have thoughts on this cast before we start jumping into to the rest of this film? I mean, good God, this movie, it is complete. It's overwhelmingly loaded, is it not? Oh gosh, and Kelly Preston. I didn't even say her name.
I really thought at the time, and I still think it's really cool. Like I said earlier, I'm sort of just repeating what I already said, but I thought it was so cool that they had three women who were kind of strong, like parts in the film, because you didn't see that in a lot of spaceflight films. Like you just don't years. I think 9 years later, Apollo 13 came out, and obviously Apollo was all men. So that's probably a bad comparison just because, factually, that's what Apollo was. It was all guys, very few women in support roles in Apollo. But obviously the shuttle program was different. But even by the time that movie had been filmed, not many U.S. women had been in space yet. Mm-hmm. So, I'm trying to count on probably less than 10. I don't think there were even that many women astronauts at the time. And never mind the Soviet Union had only had two, and historically they've had not many women in space at all. So, but I thought that was so cool as like it was really ahead of its time, you know, in a lot of ways because like I said, you still there's still issues with like gender representation in space flight, you know, and I think people are definitely more sensitive to it now, where they see spaceflight and they think, well, there's a lot of different types of astronauts. It's not necessarily one type of person or whatever. But back then, that was even less of a obvious thing, and I think that's so cool that that movie did it. Um, I have always felt the character that I loved the most in the movie, and I always felt she was sort of based on a real person, was Kate Capshaw, Andy Bergstrom, I think was her name. Or yeah, I think it was Andy Bergstrom. Am I right in that
Yeah.
character? I'm doing that from memory. It's been a long time since I've seen the whole film. Wow. But yeah, I felt, and I could be wrong, but she looked like Judy Resnick to me. She looked like a real astronaut of that era, and sadly, Resnick perished on Challenger, which is a sad coda to this film. But I felt like when they filmed the movie, when they did the film, Resnick was still alive, obviously. But if you look at her hair, she has that big perm and it's black and it's
Mm.
wild. Looks just like Judy Resnick, and she has that same kind of attitude, like I'm a badass, you know.
Where was Resnick from?
She was from near Cleveland, I think, right?
Because Capshaw's trying to do like this southern accent in the film,
For
which
about 10
doesn't
minutes, and then it
quite
goes away.
play. Have you noticed it early on? I was like, what?
Yeah.
No, okay, yeah, but I think what you're bringing up, Emily, is super important. In fact, it's actually they're really overt, and this is a very woman-dominated film. There are
It is.
obviously male parts in this, but this is dominated really between the interplay. I mean, essentially, between Andy, and Catherine, and
Yeah,
then you've got Tish kind of in the background, kind of doing some cool stuff too. But this is a woman movie, and they're also being very overt in their critiques of NASA, which I was shocked by when I was rewatching this because I was like, wait a second, this is a movie. I don't know if obviously produced in cooperation with NASA. It feels a bit like a selling point here, but they're like, yeah, the first thing you see is like Andy complaining that she got bypassed to go on the shuttle mission. You've got Catherine saying, "I'm going to be the first woman commander." Obviously, pointing the fact that that's never been done. And they're really carrying this film. Kevin, what are your thoughts on this cast here with the women specifically? I mean, this is a very women empowering film, is it not?
Yeah, for sure, and that's where I think this deviates, as Emily said, from what you had seen in previous space movies in a very significant way.
Mm.
And this is, very much tied into the image that NASA was trying to sell with the Space Shuttle program. Ever since, the 1978 class of astronauts included women and African Americans, and really during the recruitment phase, they were very overt and saying that, hey, we're flinging open our doors, the doors of the astronaut corps, to anybody, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race or religion, et cetera. And so they went out and deliberately recruited, every ethnicity. And this is where you had the first, African Americans, the first women, the first Asian Americans in the program, and that starting with that 1978 class. And so NASA continued to push that image. Now, you could argue whether or not, it was how much depth was behind that image, when it came to things like flight assignments and continuing to, recruit in certain areas. And I think there's been some solid scholarship in that area. But at least on the surface, NASA was trying to sell this image that now the space program is truly open to any American, regardless of what you look like or your gender. You can come and be an astronaut. There were, of course, some not insignificant caveats. There were still no women pilots or commanders. The women in the program were still in with the mission specialist roles. It wasn't until I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the year that you actually had the first female pilot of the space shuttle, but it was well after this movie. And
1995, I think.
that sounds right. But the issue was still that that most of the pilots were coming from the ranks of military test pilots, where women had just in the 1970s began to be in those military pilot roles, and were still, even at this time, we're not allowed to fly in combat. So that limited their flight experience relative to the men that were competing for the pilot and commander roles. So there was that very, very large gap there. So when you've got the one character saying, "Hey, I want to be the first shuttle commander," that's taking some significant leaps, because all the commanders had to be pilots, right? They had to first, typically, with the exception of the first few flights, where obviously you've got some rookies in there, but everybody had cycled first through as a pilot for the shuttle and then moved over in the commander's seat for their second or sometimes third flight, or fourth even, I think, before they became the commander of an actual mission. So yeah, I think this movie very much played into that image that NASA was selling at the time, that we are more about equality. We're a very progressive, federal agency here. Now that we're into the 1980s, we're super modern in that way. And not to cut that conversation short, but I did want to throw in a couple of other thoughts on the casting, because, like you, I went back and rewatched the movie on YouTube because it was the only place that we could find it, and just to refresh my memory, because it had been at least 30 or more years since I had seen it, probably because it wasn't available anywhere. But to me, it really struck me as sort of classic, 1980s casting, with the exception of the women. It's like you've got all these kids that are supposed to be high schoolers, but half of them look like they're in their 30s, right? It's clearly much older than the roles that they're playing there. Joaquin Phoenix is the exception because he's a little kid. But it's you got these older people playing these teenagers, and it's kind of funny how you look at it, and then everybody's kind of the blatant stereotypes. Some of them are turned on their head a little bit, but you got Tate Donovan pulling up the Jeep, blasting the music with his shirt open. It's all this sort of great 80s symbology. This guy's the rebel, he's the surfer dude, whatever. He's going to come in there and be kind of the antithesis of, yeah, exactly. But it's the antithesis of the buttoned up NASA, right? Yeah, he's not the white short sleeve shirt with the skinny black tie and pocket protector, right? He's something different than what you've seen in NASA. So again, bringing a different sort of symbology to this sort of kind of traditional space program that you saw there. So I just thought, in watching that, I'm like, man, this is kind of checking every 80s cliche box that you see. And so, from that, there's kind of that sense of nostalgia, but there is that pleasant relief that they do include those female characters that are actually the key characters in the movie. It's not just, hey, here's a pretty girl who's the girlfriend of the main character, or the sister or the mom or whatever. It's like the movie is really about those. And then the Tate Donovan character, he's basically the arm candy of the movie, right? So there's, his role is relatively minor compared to the other characters. And then you've got the little kid who's kind of key. And of course, we can't forget the robot. And maybe you want to talk about Jinx a little bit later in the podcast. But that's, another sort of 80s cliche in there that, again, is sort of full of wonderful nostalgia, right?
Well, yeah. The 80s are filled, obviously, with obviously the first thing you think about is R2D2, but you've got Jinx, you've got Johnny Five from Short Circuit.
Yeah, Short Circuit. That's exactly what. Yeah. If you think about that with all this stuff we do with AI now, right? And back in the 80s, you go think about how all these sort of independent robots were like the thing, right? Johnny Five or Jinx or R2D2 or whatever. It's kind of, 40 years ahead of where we are now in terms of AI, with all these independent, machines running around doing their own thing.
Did you see Batteries Not Included with Jessica Tandy, like way back in the day?
Oh, yeah.
The extraterrestrial robot. I mean,
I think I did. Wow. That just activated a core memory from the 80s.
Robots were having their moment in the 80s. They really were. And that probably speaks at some level. Obviously, there's another robot called Terminator that had this whole other aspect. But there was clearly, but there was clearly this thought about where robots are going to fit into our society. It's at some point in what we're seeing playing out on the on the big screen, which is saying, wait a second, these are going to be companions at some level.
You think about how ubiquitous digital computers were becoming in life in the 80s. You saw the first real home computers. We had a TRS-80 back in 1980, 81, something like that. I learned to program BASIC on it. So you saw those going in homes. Look at the music. It's all the synthesizers and electronic drums and stuff. Everything was becoming digital and electronic. It was really impacting every aspect of life. So this was sort of a natural extension of that. Well, we're going to go to these digital people, whether it's an R2D2 type or, a short circuit, whatever it might be, a Terminator, that's sort of, an extrapolation of this kind of digital age that they were moving into in the 80s. And, I remember all that very clearly. I mean, every magazine cover seemed to have something about, the new digital age and, all of this, what that was going to mean for us. We're going to be, hauling around computers on our shoulders or something. Oh, wait, now we actually have, tiny little cell phones that can do all of that stuff. It was very much an ingrained part of the culture that's really blossomed in the 80s.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I'm a Disney freak and I love Epcot. Well, back then it was called Epcot Center, but now they just call it Epcot. But I remember back in the 80s, Epcot was top shelf because it had Communicore East and West with and all the computers. And back then I was like, whoa, like this is so futuristic, y'all. And you had Horizons, which had a robot in the ride. And I just remember that as a kid thinking, wow, this is so high tech. We're going to be living in, this is life in the future and stuff. And sadly, it hasn't really come to pass, but, and a lot of, and I think all those rides are gone now, but still, I mean, that was everywhere. Like if you, that kind of, like Kevin said, that kind of iconography was everywhere. Like everything's going to be digital in the future and it's all going to be robotic and we're going to have robotic house cleaners. We're going to have robotic butlers, it was just wild. Like, and I don't know. I would like a robot butler personally, but
well, I mean, that goes back even farther back. You think about the Jetsons and things like that.
Sure.
And when you're talking about Disney World, I actually worked at Epcot. I did the college program back in '98.
Oh, wow.
So I know that.
Awesome.
I know that park inside and out. Oh yeah, that park is my park, right? And of course,
I love Epcot.
They've recently redone a bit of it. They had massive plans that they changed during COVID, and of course, I'm thinking actually what you can't see is directly behind my screen here. I'm looking over the right, which there's a massive poster of Carousel of Progress, which if you're familiar with that, kind of ends with there's a robot inside the home. It's a very dated thing at that point in time.
I almost started singing the song. Oh my god!
Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. No,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes, I
that is that.
I'm a freak about. I love all the futuristic stuff at Disney World. Like I will go on Space Mountain 10 times and not throw up. I just love it. I'll shut up. I love that stuff.
There's a fascination, right, with like retrofuturism.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. I do want to ask you though. This film comes out in '86. I think Space Camp begins in '83. You were saying, Kevin, is that right?
Somewhere around there, but don't quote me on it.
Movement by NASA's like a need to because this film feels in some ways like Baby Top Gun, right? You've got the montages, you've got Cape Canaveral essentially being Viper to Catherine's Maverick. I mean, it's lower stakes, but it's hitting some of the same beats that Top Gun does, where she's pushing her, and you've got to do this, and why are you being so hard on me? Because I see the potential. So I'm kind of wondering, did NASA see, do we need to develop? Was there wait a second, we've got to start developing this generation of astronauts because maybe, like you were saying, the enthusiasm for the space program was on the decline. What's the reason for us to have a space camp? These kids aren't going directly into space at 13, 14, 15. So why have a space camp to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't speak specifically to, sort of the business model there. Was NASA on board with them, or, was this just a business opportunity? Because obviously it would have been planned early in the Space Shuttle program when there was suddenly this enthusiasm, because with the exception and the significant exceptions of Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz test program, there really hadn't been any American space missions between, what was that, 75 and 81 when the first shuttle launched. So there was a big gap in there where kids like me didn't get to see any space launches. There were no astronauts in space. So the first shuttle launch, kind of resurrecting American access to space, was a big deal. And then maybe to a degree, NASA became a victim of its own success there because they began to launch these shuttles, and the terminology that was used, routinized space flight at the time. Well, how many times do you watch, the astronauts circle the Earth, throw out a couple of satellites, maybe do an EVA, do a repair? I mean, there were certainly some cool moments in there, and there was
Right.
the great IMAX movie about that, and Hail Columbia, those sorts of things that were really cool if you were an enthusiast. But most of my friends at that time weren't that into the space program. It's, oh wait, there's another launch. Oh wait, there's another delay. There wasn't really that sort of same kind of pioneering aspect to it, at least for my generation, that I felt, among the people who weren't just sort of innately drawn to the space program. And so when you're moving 4 years into the program, and hey, we've had 20, 23, 24 launches by the time, well, before Challenger, Challenger was the 25th launch, right? So that kind of dulled people to the excitement of it. And so with something like a space camp that keeps young people interested, not just in NASA, but in what now we call STEM, right? STEM wasn't really an acronym back then, I don't think. But NASA would certainly support that kind of thing, because we want this new generation of, scientists and engineers, hopefully scientists and engineer historians as well, involved in the space program, whether they or any other field. It's just like we do those kinds of NASA and the Air Force too engages in these educational outreach programs to increase that interest. And so it makes something like Space Camp would certainly do that, and you can see why NASA would want to be on board that, whether or not they saw it as hey, this is going to generate enthusiasm for us particularly, but it's at least going to build that base of American upcoming scientists and engineers, and like I said, this very sort of pre-STEM STEM environment.
I really can't answer that question. Only because I'm not sure what kind of like Kevin said, I don't know what kind of input NASA really had into Space Camp. I'm and my guess, like Kevin also said, I'm thinking that they probably developed it or started developing it, around the time the first space shuttle launched. Because if it opened in like '83, they probably would have had to have developed it for the curriculum, probably for a couple of years at least. So my guess is they probably started trying to, thinking about it around the time STS-1 launched in April 1981. So that's I'm I'm guessing there. If anybody from Huntsville can enlighten me on it, if someone's listening, feel free to reach out. That is perfectly fine. But no, I do think in the 80s, around the time Challenger was launched, and around the time and shortly after Space Camp was released, I think in the summer of '86, there was also another program that it wasn't really like Space Camp, but there was another program called Young Astronauts. And I was actually in that program as a kid. I was in the Young Astronauts branch, or in my school. We had guest speakers. It was really pretty cool. That I feel like around the time the space shuttle was going up, there was kind of, at least from my perspective as being an elementary school student, there was kind of increased interest in, and like Kevin said, it wasn't called STEM back then, or STEAM was not called that back then. There wasn't any acronym for it, but I think there was sort of like a focus on, okay, we got to get these kids interested in the sciences somehow, and so let's okay, space is cool. Let's do sort of a NASA centric program and stuff. So that was another thing that was kind of big at the time, was Young Astronauts. I think the kid from A Christmas Story, another movie, has nothing to do with space, but I think the kid from A Christmas Story, Ralphie, was I I think he was like sort of the Young Astronauts mascot, and I think he was actually at the Challenger launch, which is kind of sad, really. But still, yeah, I think, as Kevin was saying, I think around that time there was sort of they were. I think there was sort of a reemphasis on like STEM, and granted it wasn't called that, sort of science based education, because I think during Apollo, when I say Apollo, I mean around the time before and during Apollo 11, because after Apollo 11, public interest really just dropped off because people's attitudes became, well, we went to the moon, whatever. Why are we doing it again? They really weren't that interested in it anymore, which is kind of tragic. But there was sort of a resurgence and, getting people interested in, science and mathematics, but I think it kind of fell off until probably the shuttle program, at least the beginning of the shuttle program, when it was the brand new hot thing, and unfortunately, you know, yeah, like I said, the one I hate calling it a tragedy, but the sad thing about the movie Space Camp is I think had it been released maybe a year earlier, it would have had a better chance at the theaters. I think it's really unfortunate that it came out after such a terrible tragedy, but there was nobody could have I don't think anyone in Hollywood could have predicted that. So that's not really the fault of I get kind of irritated when I read criticism it was considered bad taste. I'm like, the movie's not a bad movie, and I don't think it doesn't show a disaster. I would think if it killed all the kids, that's really macabre. But if the kids died on Atlantis, then I would have been like, yeah, that's been bad taste. But yeah, they came home safe, and they saved the day. So I didn't feel like it was in poor taste.
Well,
I don't know.
let's talk about Challenger, because for me, when we always talk about these things like, do you remember where you were when, or the very first one of those? And for me, there's a few of those, right? But Challenger is the very first one for me, where I remember exactly where I was. I was in Tennessee. We were watching it in school. I think I was in fourth grade. I remember watching it. I remember watching it explode. I mean, I remember this. It was such a big deal because Kristen McAuliffe was on it, right? So all the teachers were very vested in this and things like that. I was shocked. I'll tell you this. When I went back to see it, I was like, oh, okay, this film came out. It must have been like 85 or some jazz like that. And I was like, wait a second. It's like, there's no way this movie comes out after Challenger. They couldn't have done that. And then I was like, wait, not only does it come out, it comes out 4 or 5 months after Challenger. I mean, it's right afterwards. All I could think was that in this day and age, first of all, there's no way this film was released in the same calendar year. This film either gets pushed to the side, they've weighed on it, something, they radically change. Nobody is going to watch a film with any kind of launch issues, because we couldn't see. You can't look at that now and not see that all over it. So I wonder, and I wasn't an adult, so I remember as a kid, I wasn't traumatized by this, by the Challengers. Just remember, this was a really bad thing. I didn't understand what trauma was, right, until I started dating. So I'm kind of wondering, Kevin, how does Challenger, when you go back to look at this film, how does Challenger affect how you look at this movie?
So, like I was saying earlier, I was a little bit older than the two of you when the movie came out. So obviously I was older when Challenger happened. Like I said, I was 12 going on 13 when the Challenger accident happened. And I do remember very vividly where I was. I was in 7th grade. We were lining up to go to lunch. I was at a small Catholic school. And like I was saying earlier, nobody in my class besides me and maybe one or two other people were interested in the space program or interested in watching even with the teacher in space launch. So they didn't show it to us. They didn't have any TVs in the classroom. They didn't have anything set up. Nobody watched it at my school. And so I remember we were lining up in the classroom, my English class, and somebody came in and said the space shuttle blew up. And I'm like, wait, what? And of course, everybody's looking to me like, what's going on? I'm like, because I'm the space nerd, right? And I'm
You're
like,
the expert, right?
Right. I don't know. This is the first I'm hearing about it. So, I mean, we literally
reports are coming in right now.
Yeah, right. It's like my antenna are wiggling. I can sense something's going on. But then they
Right.
yeah, exactly. they put us into the cafeteria for lunch, and they rolled some TVs and turned it on. And there, I just remember sitting there for the rest of the afternoon watching the same replays that everybody else did, with the mission control. Obviously there's been a major malfunction, watching the cloud and the solid rocket boosters go out. So, I mean, that really had a profound impact on me. And I mean, honestly, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I, missed this thing happening that was probably the most significant event for the space program since Apollo 11, right? The most significant thing of my lifetime, certainly. And so I just remember sitting there watching it like, what does this mean for the future of the space program? And just, really being in shock from that. And, I mean, that's all you saw on TV and in the newspapers for weeks and months afterwards. And, like I said, the sad part is it brought a lot of attention to NASA, who hadn't given a second thought to the space program for years, if at all, and, not in a good way. And you saw it start to come out in really macabre ways, to use Emily's term. There were Challenger jokes. People were making all these, jokes in poor taste about that. And even a year later, when I went to space camp, on the first day, they told us, if any of you makes a Challenger joke, we're gonna send you home. I mean, they had to warn us about that. And like I said, it was about almost a year and a half after the accident, and so it was, still very much in the public consciousness. But I think it was sort of subsumed, just like any tragedy is. On a national level, right? There's that sort of shock, and then, people process it in different ways. The negativity comes out, you've got to deal with things like investigations, then you deal with the stuff that's in poor taste. And, so I don't think it was atypical for, that other sort of national tragedy. You would have seen that with, 9/11 or probably Pearl Harbor, or, any of the Kennedy assassination, whatever those kind of historic moments that particular generations remember more than, any other. And for Gen X types like us, that was our Sputnik moment, right? That was our Kennedy assassination. And so, that whole process that went through, I think, we got to experience all those stages, just like the baby boomers would have done, or, the silent generation, or Gen Z, or whatever, with 9/11. I mean, it was the same sort of thing for us. And I said, for me personally, that it had a profound effect, and it just solidified my interest in the program. Even more, that I was really determined to go to space camp and participate in this in some way that I could, as a 13-year-old at the time.
Yeah, it's funny that Kevin said that, because Challenger did not turn me off on my interest in spaceflight at all. It made me sort of more determined to pursue it, even though obviously something horrible had happened. People had died needlessly. It didn't turn me off from being interested in it. Like, it really, I wouldn't say it ignited my passion more, but it made me, I just thought it was like, I still wanted to go on with it. My whole thing was I couldn't wait till the shuttle flew again, because I knew, that was my whole thing. I knew there'd come a time, there's this jazz song from, God, I listen to a lot of jazz nowadays. There's this song like "You Must Believe in Spring," and that's how I felt at the time, And of course, I'm 8 years old, but I felt like at the time, you must believe in that it's going to come back, And so that's what I was looking forward to when I was a kid. Like, well, they're going to launch it again, right? And that kind of owes to how young I was at the time. That you have that optimism, and you're not thinking of, now they have to go through the trauma of an investigation, because the investigation itself, and I didn't know this, I was only, like I said, I was 8 years old. The investigation itself uncovered some pretty unseemly things that, shouldn't have been happening at NASA at the time. Some very poor decisions, and but my perspective at my age at the time was, well, they'll launch it again when they fix it, and things will be good again, and just very that very 8-year-old mentality towards it. I was so young, I think, that it didn't really strike me at the time that the movie's release so close to the accident it could be construed as something tasteless. But and I'm sure there's people who will disagree with me, and that's fine. I'm willing to entertain that, but I personally didn't find the movie really offensive. Partially because, and we'll probably talk about this more, a thermal curtain failure is not a real thing, and I don't. That's not real. That can't happen. So you're all good. And they're not going to put kids on an FRF. They're not going to put kids on the pad with engines firing. They're not going to do that. Like, the movie took a few big artistic liberties. They're not going to. There's certain things you can't do at space camp. I would have loved it if they put me on an FRF if I was 8 years old. I would have been like, "This is the greatest day of my life." I would have loved that, but they're not going to do, unless they're not. They are not doing that to kids, you know. But
If I can interject for just a second. Yeah, sorry, Emily. Just to explain to the non-space people, FRF is a flight readiness firing. That was they're going to test the main engines of the shuttle on a launch pad without launching it, and they did this essentially once per shuttle, basically before each shuttle did its first flight. And I think a couple of them they repeated after they found problems, but that wasn't like a regular thing. That was just something that, hey, here's Discovery's first flight, so we're going to do a flight readiness firing. Here's Endeavor's first flight, so we're going to do a flight ready where they fire the main engines just to make sure everything works. Zero chance of it launching. Solid rocket boosters don't work that way, and so forth. But I just wanted to explain the acronym FRF for the people who are listening here who may not be familiar.
Yeah, you're awesome, because I was thinking in my head, I'm like, when did they do? They didn't do those a lot. Like, they didn't do those for every flight, but yeah, they're not going to put kids on top of a space shuttle for that. I would have volunteered myself to do that back in the day, but they wouldn't have taken me though.
They didn't even put astronauts on that. That was, obviously a lesson they learned from Apollo 1, right? If you don't need to have, a crew aboard for that kind of test, you're not going to put people in harm's way for no reason or no, functional reason there. So yeah, that's, absolutely a ridiculous sort of thing. But the biggest oversight to me there was that Space Camp was in Alabama and the space shuttle launches in Florida. So, it's kind of a little bit of a drive to.
They had to reposition Space Camp to Florida for the film, right?
Well, they did open a space camp in Florida a few years later. I don't remember the exact year, but this goes back to what we were talking about before about how it was still popular among, kids to enough that, like, when I was at space camp, they were expanding it. And then a few years later, they opened up space camp in Florida, so there was that much of a demand, for space camp itself. So obviously the Challenger didn't quite diminish everybody's interest in that, at least among the younger set. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been building those. And I don't know how long the Florida one was operational, but it shut down eventually. But at least at the time, there was enough enthusiasm for that. But when the movie was filmed and the movie came out, it was only in Alabama. So obviously it's not, you're just going to hop over the launch pad or, go sneak out the back pathway and then you can see the launch pad. That wasn't a thing then.
I think Space Camp made it like fun. Really was like the first people to be excited to visit Alabama since Ulysses Grant, So, I was setting that joke up for minutes there, Kevin. I want to ask you.
Hey,
we're talking
as an Ohio
a little
guy,
bit about. You're welcome for that.
I'm staying out of that joke. Wow.
Just like
that was like that hurt. I'm a Southerner, but I'm not one of those Southern pride people at all. But I was like, yeah, that's
Florida.
about right. Yep, that's about right.
Yeah.
When I moved to Atlanta, I pointed out that both Sherman and Grant were from Ohio, like me. So
I'm here now. Yeah, exactly. I want to ask you, what does this film do well for you when you go back? Because this film has such a nostalgic appeal. We were all excited when we lined this up. I was like, "Hey, Kevin, do you want to do Space Camp?" And you're like, "Yes," and I have just the person. What's the draw here? Like, when you go back and watch this film again on YouTube, what is this movie doing well?
For me, it's when we were talking about the right stuff, a few episodes ago, I kind of categorize, history movies, and I know that's kind of your closing thing. There's like some movies that are good movies and good history. There are some that are good movies but bad history, and some are bad movies and bad history. Well, the same is sort of true of this sort of, kind of techno history, even though it's not really history movie. It's right. Some are good movies, and then the sort of technical parts that they portray are also good. There's like realistic kind of like present day sci-fi stuff. In my opinion, this movie's pretty shaky on that front. But I mean, if you looking at it from an eyes of a kid, the target audience wasn't, adults. It's not really shooting for the, hey, I'm trying to get, mom and dad really interested in the movie. It was for the kids, the kind of target audience for Space Camp itself. And watching, putting that hat on, looking at it through my 13-year-old self, you can see the appeal, because what it does is it creates this kind of plausible fantasy. You're like, hey, I can go to space camp and, oh my gosh, I can imagine myself, sitting up there on the space shuttle, and whoops, it takes off. It really kind of sparks that imagination. To me, there's sort of that emotional grab that it does really well. It finds this kind of hook, like, hey, as a kid, you can have this. What if you had a chance to go into space? And if, whether you're, 8-year-old Emily or 13-year-old Kevin or whatever, imagining yourself in space, and you're seeing it happen. And it's really easy to, see yourself sitting in that commander spot. So I think they do a good job of connecting to that target audience, even though, if you're the, kind of, well, what about this, kind of guy, or, well, actually, kind of stuff, you can tear this movie apart from, start to finish. It's obviously not, highly accurate. They throw all that stuff out the window in order to tell that larger story, to have this kind of excitement. What if this goes, what if this thing actually happens? They don't worry about, well, how does 13 hours turn into about 20 minutes in movie time? And, when they're running out of oxygen, and, oh, wait, we can't get random oxygen tanks out of a space station truss, but a little kid wearing the same suit can go get that oxygen tank. Anyway, you just gotta suspend your disbelief in a big way to really appreciate this movie. So yeah, as a middle-aged dude now, the movies, there's a lot of eye rolling in there, but like I said, you're kind of looking at it through 13-year-old eyes. You can see why the kids would have loved this movie, because it really just kind of creates that plausible fantasy for them. And kids are much more willing to suspend their disbelief and not pick apart that stuff, or at least they were back in the 80s. I don't know if that's the case anymore. I guess I should go ask my own kids.
I think the movie Space Camp, like Kevin said, it is for kids. There's a lot of stuff that is totally factually incorrect. I'm glad he mentioned the fact that the space shuttle is not in Huntsville. It's not on the pad in Huntsville. They didn't really quite explain how they got to Huntsville to Merritt Island that quickly, but yeah, and there's a lot of things that are factually incorrect, but I think the movie, despite that, I think it kind of represents a neat cultural moment of the 1980s, because like I said earlier, the movie had very strong women characters, and there was sort of a, this conflict, like, this sort of master to Padawan, this this sort of, Jedi type, Jedi relationship between Andy and Catherine, like I'm gonna you gotta dot your I's and cross your T's type of thing, that kind of thing. So I thought that was kind of a neat sort of a cultural moment of showing women mentorship, which was like, wow, that's really deep for a movie from 1986, like, and as a girl growing up at that time, it's like you didn't see that a lot, and especially in like cinema. So that was really interesting. And it represents just sort of a hopefulness in a way, because I've talked about this before. For me, now it's very cheesy. I want to add a caveat. If you go watch this movie on YouTube, you're going to be like, this is the cheesiest visual effects of all time. It was 1986. This is the best they had. So just bear with it. Keep in mind, Tron was like 4 years earlier. And yeah, and at the time, Tron was like, whoa, this is the greatest visual effects ever. So just accept that. But I thought them showing Space Station Daedalus, aka sort of Frankenstein Space Station Freedom. Let me.
Yeah. What's going on with the space station here? Because I'm like, is this pre-International Space Station? What's going on with the space station thing?
Can I explain?
Please, because I was lost. I was like, that's some really. I don't even know. Is that Chekhov's like oxygen tank? I mean, I just don't know what it was. So,
well, okay. Kevin, you can jump in too, because you probably know more about this than I do. But okay, during the 1980s, um, by that point in U.S. space history, there had only been one space station, and it's on my shirt. It was Skylab,
Skylab, right?
and that was had kind of a not a very long operational period where they had people on it, but that was the only thing that we had as far as a space station um, by the 80s ever. And in the mid 80s or early to mid 80s, there were a lot of concepts put around for Space Station Freedom. That's what it was called, and it would be a U.S. space station. There were several different designs for it. One of them was like a, I think it was called the Power Tower or something, and it had this very kind of distinctive truss design, really fancy looking, you know. But there were several different designs for it, and I think a lot of different contractors working on it at the same time. I've talked to astronaut Fred Hayes, who was flew Enterprise, the space shuttle, and he also flew Apollo 13. He was one of the guys on Apollo 13, and he was working for Northrop Grumman at the time, or I think they were just called the Grumman Corporation at the time. But he was working for them, and he was working on Space Station Freedom at the time. And I asked him about that. I was like, "What was that like working on Space Station Freedom?" And he was like, "It was purgatory." And I'm like, "What do you mean by that?" And he was like, "There was just every week they would change something. Like there was never anything constant. Like it was always just up in the air." And of course, Challenger also kind of changed that timeline as well. But eventually, I'm cutting a very long story short. But eventually, that some of the designs for that space station kind of coalesced into what became the International Space Station, which is still flying above us today. And the ISS also has, you know, a Russian segment, and it's got modules from different countries, like, you know, in different parts of the world as well. So, but there are elements of it that are still sort of like, okay, this is what it, you know, that are parts of what was like supposed to be like Space Station Freedom. But Daedalus was sort of like a composite. It was sort of a composite version of Space Station Freedom, what that was supposed to look like. It had the cool trusses on it, and it was, yeah, it was really cool. But it was kind of a hopeful vision of what the U.S. future in spaceflight was supposed to look like during the 1980s, because and it's kind of sad because a lot of that, with unfortunately with Challenger and after Challenger, you know, just with bureaucratic stuff, it really, that just wasn't to be, you know. And I know a few people, God, I feel like such a name dropper. I've talked to a few astronauts who are Apollo guys, and they worked on Freedom, you know, and they communicated their frustrations because, you know, it just, they never could get anything pushed forward with it. You know, it was just a lot of like, okay, we got to change this, and dealing with a million different contractors, and every contractor is like competing with another contractor, and they're all fighting, you know, that just crap like that, you know, where everybody's ego is just holding stuff back. And yeah, that's the reality. That's the reality of what was going on at the time versus, you know, in Space Camp, it was already built and everything was happy. And well, despite them losing oxygen and having to find oxygen tanks, but still, it was like, yeah, there's the space station and it's fully built and it's, you know, beautiful and all this. So I probably rambled on twice as long as I should have, but I do think the film represents kind of a neat cultural, like, point of what the U.S. viewed. If you're looking at it through a space historian's eyes, it sort of represented the diversity that we were hoping to get, and also the future we were hoping to get, which one of them happened and one of them didn't happen quite as quickly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you want to back your history up even more, before there was a shuttle program, when we were still doing Apollo, NASA was looking at what should be the follow-on there, and there was a tremendous push to make it a space station, right? Especially from the folks out at Huntsville, that's the next step is, hey, we're going to live in space, right? We're going to go do that, and that'll be the stepping stone to the moon or Mars, the sort of things that we're talking about now. But because of the way interstellar rivalries worked and that sort of thing, they came to the conclusion that in order to get a space station up, or at least this sort of modular space station that's going to be assembled up there instead of something like Skylab that's sent up in one big piece, then we need some means of getting to space efficiently. We can't throw away a 363-foot rocket every time we want to go into orbit, right? We need something reusable. And so they decided that the first step toward a space station was to build this space truck, right? That's why they call it the Space Shuttle, that is going to get us routinely to space dozens of times a year. So they settled on that Space Shuttle. Well, because of congressional funding and a bunch of other things, they ended up with a space shuttle that wasn't really ideal for that role, or you could argue for any role, really. It was kind of a clue, different requirements put together that, kind of served all of them. The jack of all trade, masters of none kind of shuttle that you got there. But they never, once they got the shuttle flying, that sort of sucked up the majority of NASA's budget to get this thing built and then flying. The operational costs were huge, much larger than what NASA anticipated. And there wasn't yet the market for, getting paid to put all the, enough satellites up into space. There wasn't the sort of commercial satellite industry like we have now, although NASA was trying to encourage that. But it was that lack of funding that helped delay the next step, which was building the space station. And like Emily said, there were all these designs going around to different contractors. It was seen as sort of a big pork barrel, to use 1980s terms, right? Program, who's going to get this? Which congressional districts are that going to go to? So, had all these different designs and different contractors that are messing around. And it just basically delayed the whole idea of building a space program until after Challenger. And then even after, we had the return to flight, 2.5 years later, the space station was still, in flux. It was let's see, it went from Space Station Freedom to Space Station Alpha, I think, or was it the other way around? One was Alpha, one was Freedom, and then we ended up at International Space Station. Well, once the Berlin Wall fell, we got the Russians involved, and then 98 was when the first elements of International Space Station went up. So you can see, well after, decades after shuttles started flying, you finally had the space shuttle built. But in this sort of space camp movie era in 86, you had the astronauts doing experiments related to it. They built long trusses out of the shuttle bay. I think they deployed some roll-up solar arrays and things like that, basically doing technology demonstrations that could transition and enable these different designs for space stations that would one day go up there. So even though there was nothing in place at that time that the movie was made in 86, that was at least on the drawing board, and nobody anticipated that it would still take another, dozen years before we would have a space station, up in even in a very small way. And so that, that's important to note that, yeah, we didn't have a station, but we were planning on it. That was a big part of our plans. But like anything else, politics, technology, the, Challenger accident, obviously all of that got in the way to really delay those plans. Which I think I've gotten away from your original question quite a bit there, Jason. So if you want to either refresh my memory or come up with a different one.
I'm like, I'm thinking about this idea of the space shuttle as a space truck, knowing that space camp and so much of this is set in Alabama. And now I'm thinking about like Luke Combs singing a song calling like She Needed Space, but, or something along those lines. And now it has something else entirely. Like the songs now are just writing themselves, where it's like you've got like good old boys who are actually, your PhD chemists in the space shuttle singing about the space shuttle. Like, what do these songs look like now? This is what I want to see. I want to, instead of talking about their Ford or their Chevys, they're talking about the Endeavor or the Columbia or the, or whatever. Like, where do we go from here? And it's just like what they're like quite literally going on into, into space.
So let me pause there, Jason. So maybe Emily can answer this. What is the single greatest song written about the space shuttle program?
I know what it is. I think I know what it is. Countdown by Rush?
Yes! The Canadian band. The Canadians wrote the greatest song. And you want to talk about techno enthusiasm.
They don't have a space program.
They built the arm for the shuttle. So Rush was invited to the STS-1 launch, and they wrote the song Countdown for it, and it uses clips from the audio clips in that. Rush is my favorite band. That's why I'm talking about this. Got to throw that in there. I've got some a whole bunch of Rush memorabilia around in the next room from where I'm sitting right now. But yeah, it's. I mean, you're talking about the the Alabamans writing songs about it. Well, it turns out the Canadians are the ones writing about the space truck.
Well, first of all, I'll have to remember to have you back on, Kevin, when we do a podcast about the worst bands in history. So, come on, Rush.
Yes,
dude, for real. All right, that's fine. All right.
I get. Oh yeah, I should show you. I should show you the next room.
All right, I want to ask you this, and this is a thing I've been playing with on the pod. Starting to think about this. This movie comes out in '86. Our cast members are young people at the time. What happens to our cast members? I'm just going to say off some names here. We'll start with the big ones. I'm going to talk about the kids. I'm going to Andy. We know finally gets to fly, but like, what happens to Catherine? Does she end up going to Colorado Springs to the Air Force Academy just up the road here? What happens to Catherine? Does she stay in on track? Does she become an astronaut? What happens to her?
I think she probably goes to the Naval Academy or because the Naval Academy was accepting women students at that time, or the Air Force Academy is just as fine. And I don't know if I know Eileen Collins first commanded a shuttle flight in 1999, so Eileen may have beaten her to the punch a bit, but I think she definitely would have commanded one before the program's end.
Yeah, I think she seemed driven and committed to that goal, right? And that's what when you talk to any of the astronauts, particularly in the shuttle era, when asked, how do you become an astronaut? None of them say, well, go check these boxes. It's commit yourself to being really good at something that's relevant to the space program, and then the rest will follow. And she seemed to have that drive where, hey, this is what I want to do. And as we saw in the movie, she was committed to making that happen. She had some missteps that, you got to have the drama, of course, in the movie. But it seemed like she had, to pun intended, she had the right stuff to make it into the astronaut program and end up flying on the shuttle, in my humble opinion.
All right. What about Kevin? Kevin, I'll go back to you this time. What happens to Tate Donovan? What happens to my slacker?
Yeah, he becomes a surfing instructor in Hawaii, and lives on the beach somewhere. That's my opinion.
Emily, what do you think?
I think he's in prison for insider trading.
I was thinking something along those lines. I was thinking
That's mean. That's mean.
I'm thinking United States Senator. It's clearly that he comes from money. Daddy wants him to go to space camp. He's going to use the fame, which obviously these guys are coming. My problem with this film is that it just stops. Like she lands the shuttle.
Yep.
In the dark at White Sands, and like that's it. There's nothing else. And you have to imagine these people are instantaneously famous. A bunch of teenagers flew a space shuttle, right? Like they're going to be vaulted into fame. They'll be on the cover of Time and all of these kinds of things, right?
In the movie, they're hiding it from people, right? They're not even telling the media they just launched a space shuttle. I mean, it's crazy.
Right. That's right. In the movie,
it's got to get out.
Like Morse code. They don't even have. Yeah, they don't have a radio in the movie. That's right.
Nobody's going to notice that giant rocket launch.
Right? Especially in Merritt Island. like people are just chilling and all of a sudden, why are my windows shaking all of a sudden? Like, no one's going to see that.
All right, one more. What about Max? What happens to River to Lee Phoenix's to Joaquin Phoenix's character? What happens to young Max?
I think he becomes an engineer. He's got bad eyes, so he's not going to go. He's not going to go fly. But he becomes an engineer. He goes to work for, say, Martin Marietta. Becomes a DoD contractor. Spends his life working classified programs and helps develop some sort of AI enabled stealth drone technology, but lives his life completely in that black world. That's what I think happens to him.
Oh God, I was gonna say something stupid like maybe he starts a podcast about his experiences in
about
space.
movies,
Yeah,
right?
about his experiences in space. You know, he interviews like other kids who were unfairly put into the spotlight. I don't know. I don't. I don't know. Maybe something like that. Kevin's answer is far more dignified.
You know, I'm thinking actually. I think I'm along your lines, Emily, because I'm thinking Coke habit. Listen, we're talking about three people in the '80s. Nobody, you can't get out of the '80s without somebody having a Coke habit. So I'm
Yeah.
going to go with Max. Max is doing probably 25 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary.
Wow.
He's in a Supermax. He's actually in the Supermax in Colorado, where Catherine can come visit him because she's now an instructor at the Air Force Academy.
Yeah.
That's my final
And
answer.
she's still, you know, they're still friends, even though things have taken rather dark.
There's a Netflix series, right, waiting to be made where like they're still friends from across. They're talking on the phone across the thing.
They need to do a follow up on this movie now that we're like 10 years later.
My alternative suggestion is that he grows up to become the guy in Office Space with the red stapler. I can't remember the character's name, but I think that could be Max as an adult.
Basement. Yeah.
Oh my god! At some point, I have to do that movie on this pod. I have to figure out who's going to write a book on really effed up Office Spaces. All right, let me ask you this. This is going to be our penultimate question here. What's your favorite space shuttle and why?
Okay, it's kind of a sad answer. Um, but my favorite shuttle is actually Columbia. Uh, I got to see her launch a few times from across the state, and that was the first shuttle I saw launch. That was the one that started everything for me. Uh, I've told this story a couple times before, but the first launch I saw, I was really little. Like my family, we had just moved to that part of Florida. I was still a toddler. The first launch I remember seeing like vividly was STS-2, because what happened was I was, like I said, I was a toddler. I wasn't in school, and my mom was like, "Hey, let's go outside and watch the shuttle go up." And I knew what the space shuttle was, and I knew it like I'd seen like a picture of it, or it probably seen it on TV or something. So I was like, okay, let's go and watch the shuttle. So we looked to the east outside, and I'm looking up, and you could see this orange flame, and then you could see it curve around the Earth. You could curve, and then you saw these ding, the little tiny, they look like matchsticks, boosters come off, and then you could see the engines. You could see just the blue. It was like a bluish, like a clean flame, you know, from the engines. And I still vividly remember that. Like that, I mean, even though I was tiny, I remember thinking, "Holy crap, those people are going to space." That is amazing. Like I was just obsessed. Like it was a very visceral moment for me. So years later, I was like, as an adult, I was like, "What freaking launch was that?" Because I'm like, that had to have been in like 81 or 82, and I'm trying to track it down in my head because I was like, I know we had just moved to Oldsmar. That's where I lived as a kid. I know we just moved to Oldsmar at the time, so I'm trying to do the math in my head. Like, what launch was that? And then I realized it was STS-2. It was Columbia. It was the second space shuttle launch. And recently, we lost the two gentlemen who flew that flight. We lost General Joe Engle and Admiral Richard Truly, which is very sad to me because it's like a whole era is just disappearing of amazing people. But yeah, that was the shuttle that for me just hooked. That was the launch that hooked me on everything. And ever since, God, it's been a long time. Ever since then, I've just been obsessed with space in general. And you know, as much as the shuttle was not the vehicle it was promised to be, I still love it. I loved watching the launches. I loved it even though it wasn't perfect. So that was the one that got me.
Kevin?
So I would say for nostalgia purposes, I would also do Columbia. But when I went to space camp, I don't know if you can read this, they would assign you to a particular orbiter as your crew. So I was Team Atlantis.
There you go.
So from then on, I bought the hat that says Atlantis on it, U.S. Space Academy. That was the sort of slightly older than space camp version. but also Atlantis kind of remained my kind of favorite because it did most of the DoD, the Department of Defense flights, and especially after the Challenger accident, that's the one that put up the most classified missions. So in terms of contributions to national security, Atlantis was that bird, and there was some hope as a long shot that Atlantis might end up here at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton. I don't think there was a lot of belief it would come here, but if they did get an orbiter, that was kind of the one they wanted because of its connection to the deploying the DoD satellites and such.
Yes, I would honestly say yes. I think it's like I said earlier. I'm probably just repeating what I said. I think it shows a definite like sort of a cultural moment where like the space shuttle was the king or the queen. The space shuttle was the space vehicle. Despite its obvious problems, it kind of came at a weird cultural moment because Challenger had just happened. Um, but to me, it is sort of a history movie, even though it may have not stood up well. Even though people are going to be in my inbox like, "How dare you say that it's not accurate? It's not accurate." And I don't. So what? It's a movie. It's not. They didn't send kids into space. Okay, we know that wasn't going to happen.
I
But
don't know. You haven't seen those DoD missions, but go on.
they have put kids in the. Yeah, they may have vaulted kids into
On
space.
In Atlantis, they were in the cargo hold. They're just shot putting them out.
Yep.
Go on.
Yep. But no, I do think it's a historic. I think it's sort of a relic of the time, and I think if you want to, granted, it's probably not an easy or a fun watch for somebody in their 40s or 50s to watch because it's more geared towards younger people. Um, but I do think it's sort of an interesting cultural artifact, and it kind of shows even though there are some nefarious things that happen in the movie, that where the kids are like kind of in scary situations on the shuttle. Um, I do think it sort of shows the hopes we had for that time. That we'd have a space station and that you know regular people could go to space and that we'd have sort of a diverse presence in space. I think those things were things that a lot of people in space flight were thinking about, and they were trying to reflect it in the movie. So I do think it does have sort of a cultural aspect to it in that situation. So yeah, I do think it's a historical movie. It might not be the most accurate or the most exciting special effects movie, but I think it's kind of a neat relic of the time.
Yeah, I was going to actually turn this question back on you at the end because you've obviously covered more than your share of Cold War movies, 80s movies here. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this. But to provide just more of my own sense of context, if you look at this movie coming out in 86, it sort of continues a line of movies, this sort of Reagan era, Cold War flicks that have a certain sort of enthusiastic, patriotism isn't quite the right word, a little bit of nationalism and enthusiasm there. It's Top Gun comes out that summer, Iron Eagle, where, the guy steals the F-16. It's a kid doing that stuff, right? Red Dawn, was at 84, a few years earlier, War Games, these kind of movies where you've got sort of younger people saving the day, but in a very nationalistic sort of sense, right? And what's more American than the space program, right? Well, maybe it's fighter jets and off of aircraft carriers, or bombing terrorists in a stolen F-16, or fighting the communists who invaded your beloved Colorado. There's this whole kind of sequence of movies in this Reagan era where kind of post the 1980 election, where he's like, it's morning in America again. He's trying to get us out of those 1970s doldrums. And so there's this sort of cultural awakening in that sense, this sort of renewed sense of patriotism, like, yeah, make America great again, to use a politically loaded phrase. But, in those terms, it was very much real, right? And he put his money where his mouth was, he being Ronald Reagan, in supporting, the buildup of the Department of Defense, right? Suddenly, we're going from this sort of post-Vietnam era to now we're going to, really build up the military industrial complex. We're going to recapitalize the Air Force. We've got all these new airplanes, like the F-15 coming online, really cool stuff. But then even more than that, he's kind of leveraging sci-fi stuff. The Strategic Defense Initiative, what they called Star Wars, right? Laser satellites up in space that incidentally are going to be deployed by the Space Shuttle, right? Once they get around to building these things. There's going to be the National Aerospace plane, or what he called the Orient Express, the X-30, where it's going to be a scramjet powered kind of next generation shuttle that's going to take off from a runway, go to Mach 15 and get you into Tokyo from Washington, D.C. 2 hours later, or whatever the math was, right? So there's, this sort of enthusiasm about the technology that was very much tied into the sort of, sense of being an American. And then this was targeted at kids through these movies where you see kids participating in that, whether, like I said, whether it's fighting the communist invaders or going out and, fighting them off, using fighter jets, or, going up into space and using that technology. And the flip side of that, of course, is that none of the technology is perfect, right? They all have some sort of, there's some sort of quirk there. It's like technology is not the only solution, but you know what? It's sort of this human spirit, particularly this American human spirit and ingenuity, that's going to overcome those limits of technology, right? Whether it's Goose dying during the ejection, or here where it's, the shuttle running out of air, or, they're getting stuck in space, or, the Whopper machine in war games that's going to play global thermonuclear war. There's all those, kind of limits to technology, but it's really, the people here, these great Americans that overcome that. And I think this is just, one piece in that sort of string of movies that comes out that, when you're looking at it, as Emily put it, as cultural artifacts, this is very much a historical movie, even though it's not a history movie in that it's telling any actual history. So I'm curious now, Jason, as you're, having seen these movies, having talked to other historians about sort of Cold War movies, what are your thoughts on that? How do you think this fits into that pantheon of Cold War flicks?
I think you're absolutely nailing this, because it's absolutely a Cold War film wrapped up in the sense of nostalgia and childhood wonder and things like that. There's a film that this continues to remind me of, strangely starring Joaquin Phoenix's brother, called The Explorers. I don't know if you recall this film or not, but it is a bunch of kids end up going outer space, encounter some aliens, actually, and they're wrapped up in a tilt-a-whirl. But for me, I look back on this, and this feels like Top Gun for teens. Is really what this is. Like, we're the best. Look, we can go and do these things. It's all wrapped up in this idea of, in a lot of ways, of American exceptionalism. Our teens are going to go to space. Our teens can do this. Our teens can do that, and things like that. And it's so overwhelmingly positive. At the same time, right? It's doing some this film. The open critiques of the male-dominated NASA system in this is not what I was expecting to see when I came back to watch this film. I wasn't really prepared for this. I remember it was being dominated by Leah Thompson. I remember it as a kid. I was like, it was definitely Leah Thompson's film. But to hear the words and things like that, I was like, it's actually a really interesting study of like where the United States is mid 80s during the Reagan administration, like what we're doing, what we're spending our money on, and what we're trumpeting as a people. And then, of course, there's the meta goals here, the meta stuff where we're talking about like why this film got released when it did. I wonder sometimes, we've talked on and on and on about the idea about when to release this film so soon after Challenger. And I wonder if perhaps this may have been a quick, like, this one was obviously already on the schedule, but the decision to go ahead and release this following the success of Top Gun, because Top Gun's just doing crazy things 3 weeks earlier at the box office. I wonder if this was maybe an idea, like a stopgap to stop the bleeding, the mourning, or something like that of the Challenger thing, to say, look, these are our kids. We still love space, blah, blah, blah. Even though it felt like, for me, Emily, like the 2.5 years between Space Shuttle launches after Challenger felt like an eternity. There's some real questions I think you can have with this film. Talk about the 80s that I don't know that I would have really considered years ago. So I don't know, Kevin. That's a long and rambling answer, but I feel like this is absolutely a history film. Like, and it comes at this, and it's really one of those unlikely history films where you look at this and go, "Holy cow!" You can come at history in like 4 or 5 different angles to see what this film is doing and how and why. And then on top of this, the whole nostalgia piece, because as we said from the outgo, people love this movie. It has this cultural affection that I don't know that people really give it credit for. But there's a reason why I wanted to have this movie on here, because I had a tie to it, and it wasn't hard to find other people who would want to come on and talk about this movie.
I just wanted to add, I loved it as a kid, and I still like this aspect, even though the movie is somewhat dated now. As a kid, I loved the movie. It showed like women with swagger. Like Andy Bergstrom was kind of tough, and she was married to an old Apollo guy who was kind of grizzled, and but that didn't define her. She was like this really, this tough woman with this awesome perm, and she, and I loved Judy Resnick as a kid because the movie The Dream is Alive, the IMAX film that Kevin discussed earlier, it had Judy Resnick very prominently in it. And, she had this amazing, beautiful, I hate focusing on her hair only because she was an amazing astronaut as well, but she was iconic as far as just a visual thing, like, wow, this thing, this really beautiful, gutsy woman is in space, and that for me growing up, seeing that was a huge moment. I was like, whoa, she's doing that. That's so cool. And I love that the film had like a protagonist that was like that. That was just this gutsy, fearless woman with this big perm, who was just kind of like tough. I love that. And that really made a big impression on me as a kid, where I was like, man, I want to be like that someday. That was really cool. So for me, it was kind of I guess a gender cultural moment. I don't know, as as a little girl growing up during that time, looking, because there weren't many women astronauts at that point. There really weren't. There weren't many women in aerospace. There wasn't, there just was not really a focus on that as much as, now we talk about that, and back then it was more like, okay, we've hired some women, we've solved the problem, and this movie was talking about that. I thought that was really neat.
One thing we kind of glossed over a little bit when looking at this as a cultural artifact and talking about Challenger particularly is we didn't really discuss how this fits in with the Teacher in Space program. Because obviously Krista McAuliffe was on Challenger, and that was the big draw, right? Is that you have a non-professional astronaut on there. I don't mean to say she's not a professional, but she wasn't a career astronaut, or they had payload specialists, that kind of class on shuttle that weren't professional astronauts either, were there to manage the satellite or whatever. And one of those perished on Challenger as well. But in terms of somebody who was, a quote unquote civilian coming into the program, and this idea that people who aren't, dedicated scientists and engineers for the astronaut corps who aren't, experienced pilots, flying the shuttle, it's, hey, now we're going to, to use the term I used earlier, democratize the space program, where, hey, now that this is routine because of the shuttle, we can have essentially passengers on board or people who aren't specialized in aspects of space flight, but can do these different things in space. Teacher in Space was the first step to that. Also actively, near the selection, going through the selection process for the journalist in space program at that time when Challenger exploded. And, I've heard different rumors about who they had in mind or who the finalists were. There are a handful of names out there. You can go Google that. And I'm sure there's more answers out there than I'm familiar with. But that was kind of the next step. But that wasn't going to be the last one. It's, well, should we put artists in space? Who should go up there if we've got these extra seats? Well, hey, they put congressmen up there, right? Jake Garn infamously was one of them. The current NASA administrator, right, was one of these guys who got to go up. There was a Saudi prince. It's okay. Well, now the shuttle is making it possible so that anybody, even kids, like in this movie, can go in space and do something meaningful, even if they're not operating the vehicle, right? It's just like, it would be on an airplane, right? You go fly on an airplane. Well, just because you're sitting in back doesn't mean you need to know anything about aerodynamics or, roll, pitch, and yaw, or the systems of the airplane. You can just be back there doing your thing. And so the idea was that the shuttle could do that. So when this movie was being filmed in 1985, it was in the midst of that context, right? That we've got Teacher in Space and we've got these other programs kind of lined up. So this was kind of a natural fit for that. Well, hey, kids are going to go up there, and guess what? The shuttle's safe enough, that these kids can bring it back. It's almost like Space Shuttle for Dummies sort of thing. So to me, that's kind of an important artifact of that time, right? You wouldn't imagine that would be happening. I don't think this movie could have been made after Challenger, to put kids in peril on the shuttle. There'd be like, well, there's no way NASA is going to do this. So, that was that just in that kind of end of that kind of halcyon period of the shuttle program, where the kind of doors were wide open, where NASA still thought they were going to fly twice a month and, do all of these different things. And obviously Challenger brought all of that to a halt, and probably rightfully so, given the relative immaturity of the system that they found out the hard way there. And then obviously again, a couple of decades later with the Columbia accident. So I just wanted to throw that out there. If Emily or Jason, if you guys have any thoughts on how this fits in with the Teacher in Space sort of thing as well.
No, I think Kevin touched on a really awesome and important point, is that the image of the shuttle program pre-Challenger was definitely, oh yeah, this can send regular people to space, just like you and me, just like, because the shuttle had kind of a relatively non-torturous, G load. You weren't going to get 10 Gs going up, coming back down, anything like that. I think it was like 3 Gs max or something like that. But it was basically the in the 70s, the pitch to Congress was, oh yeah, this will make space flight, routine. We're gonna put these up every 2 weeks, and they're gonna come down, and we're gonna, and we'll turn them around every 2 weeks, and we'll just have them flying all the time like an aircraft. That was literally the sales pitch to Congress, like, and it'll pay for itself. It's not going to be that expensive, and yada yada, and we'll be able to send regular people into space. Just like you and me. And yeah, that was really the sales pitch for the shuttle. I think in the 70s, in some space literature that I've read, they actually said, oh yeah, by 1992 we'll have 500 missions done already. Just, yeah, I mean, just crazy stuff. I mean,
Commonplace.
the idea was it'll be like flying an airplane. It's going to make space flight so easy and so accessible, anybody can do it. And Space Camp does touch into that, because it shows that, oh yeah, kids can fly into space too. And obviously for many reasons they probably shouldn't, but the movie particularly legal ones, but no, but the movie does show it that, oh yeah, space is accessible to anybody, which is a positive message. That is a positive message. Do I want kids doing it? No. Do I want minors doing it? Probably not. But there is sort of that, oh, space can be for everybody message. And it's funny because now we're seeing that start to actually come to fruition. We're seeing
Exactly
commercial astronauts who are not affiliated with NASA. The most recent example I can think of is Polaris Dawn is supposed to launch, I think, in a few days. And they're not NASA astronauts. They're Polaris Dawn astronauts, and they're going to do the first commercial EVA ever in the history of space. And I'm really excited about that, because to me it does represent. I'm nervous, but I'm excited about it, because to me it represents the promise of the 70s. And oh god, Kevin's gonna roll his eyes into his head because I talk about this person way too much. But it represents the promise that people like futurists like Gerard K. O'Neill, I got it out of my system. uh, you know it represents a promise that people like that, it represents their vision of, okay, one day we're going to be able to see regular people who aren't necessarily NASA trained go to space and live in space, perhaps. And I so the movie does kind of have a tie into that in its own weird kind of nonsensical way, but it does. So yeah, I totally agree with Kevin on that.
I'm so glad we had the chance to come back and like revisit this film. I feel like we could probably spend another hour and a half to 2 hours talking about this movie all over again. And there's no shortage of other space films for us to talk about as far as when we get into, I mean, there's a fascination, I think, always. And it was depicted early on in Catherine's when as a child, she's talking about how she could so forth. But like, even for us now, space, it's depicted in the films that we watch and things like that, all the way down to Max quoting Star Wars, even to me, where even I got tired of listening to him talk like, come on, kid.
Shut up. Yeah.
I say this, there's a TIE fighter over my left shoulder. Guys, thank you so much for being here and talking to us about this film. This was a blast.
I got it. Okay. Yeah, it was awesome. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm really honored. Thank you so much.
Hey, yeah, and I'm especially honored to be asked back, so it means I must not have screwed up the first time too much, so I appreciate that.
Got a low bar here, Kevin. We're just keeping it low. We're doing great. And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guests, Kevin Rusnak and Emily Carney. Guys, thank you so very much for being here. Thank you, of course, to our own Mission Control, Fletcher Powell. Thank you, Fletcher, for continuing to make the show run. Most of all, thank you to all of you for being part of the HATM community. If you want to support HATM, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historians of the movies. You can be a producer of this very show. So thank you for continuing to be here, for sharing this show with your friends, for posting it on social media. Thanks for being here, guys. Ciao for now.